house that once shone with lamps of industry now hides its shadows in silence. A family that seemed to embody domestic harmony now lingers in the margins of rumor. A man celebrated as the very symbol of progress prith behind only whispers of horror. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year was 1834, and the township of Hollowford, Indiana, was still a raw, half-hewn settlement clinging to the edge of modernity. Timber-framed homes leaned into the smoke of new forges, and the soil was streaked with the residue of coal ash, a harbinger of industry's advance. To most who passed through, Hollowford seemed an emblem of American promise, a frontier being tamed, a wilderness turned to fields and mills. Yet even in its earliest accounts, parish registers and court ledgers whisper of a family whose presence unsettled the peace. That family was the Arkwrights, descendants of English ironworkers who had crossed the Atlantic with little but their craft and their secret. Their patriarch, Benedict Arkwright, arrived with his first wife in 1829. Within 5 years, the number of wives had grown to 7, and the children to nearly 24. By 1834, the townspeople counted 31 women attached to the Arkwright name, with 89 offspring catalogued in church baptismal records, though curiously, not all names were inscribed in order or consistency. On paper, Benedict Arkwright seemed the model of a self-made industrialist. He established a steel foundry that supplied rails for the emerging Midwest lines, cast iron works for bridges, and ornamental steel that decorated new courthouses. Local newspapers praised him as a benefactor who brought prosperity, employing immigrants and orphans in equal measure. His estate, Blackthorne Hall, rose on a hill just outside town, a sprawling red brick manor with wings continually added to house his wives, his offspring, and a rotation of apprentices. But within the margins of these same reports, in the letters of schoolmasters, in the diaries of traveling ministers, one finds unease. The scale of the household defied not only propriety but comprehension. 31 wives, simultaneously, others by arrangements that remained opaque, moved through corridors under a rule more rigid than any convent. 89 children, many pale and stunted, lived under timetables of study and labor designed by their patriarch, with the meticulousness of a factory overseer. The first signs of irregularity surfaced in parish death records. Between 1834 and 1836, 11 Arkwright infants were noted as deceased, yet no graves could be located in the churchyard. Midwives who had attended certain births ceased their service at Blackthorne Hall abruptly, citing unnamed offenses and leaving the parish altogether. A doctor, summoned from Fort Wayne to treat a fever outbreak among the children, recorded in his case ledger that the symptoms resembled those of prolonged malnourishment and airless confinement. That page of his ledger was later torn, yet a faint imprint remained, legible only under Neighbors whispered but did not intervene. Benedict's influence was too great. His steel was needed, his contracts lucrative, and his manner polished, learned, steeped in scripture, disarmed criticism. He quoted Milton and St. Paul with equal ease, cloaking his peculiar household arrangements in the language of providence and destiny. To some, he explained that his many wives were widows he had rescued from poverty. To others, that his children were orphans he had legitimized by adoption. Yet the arithmetic of the census did not align with his explanations, and the hollow eyes of the women glimpsed at market stalls suggested less of rescue than of captivity. What unsettled observers most was the discipline of the children. Townsfolk reported that the Arkwright brood rarely spoke in public, moving in groups under the watchful eye of hired men. Their clothing was identical, coarse wool uniforms stitched with brass buttons, and their hair was shorn to a regulation length, regardless of age or sex. When they attended Sunday service, they filed into pews in perfect symmetry, eyes lowered, lips still. Teachers at the Hollowford schoolhouse noted that the Arkwright children possessed unusual aptitude in arithmetic and mechanical drawing, but showed little capacity for play or social exchange. It is as though one schoolmistress wrote in 1835, "They are instructed to live as instruments rather than as children." Rumors began to circulate about the basement levels of Blackthorne Hall. Deliveries of limestone and brick arrived weekly, yet no new wing was visible above ground. Men working the quarries claimed they had been contracted to supply materials for cellars of unusual depth. Carters spoke of hearing sounds of hammering from underground even at night. In taverns, whispers suggested that the hall contained passageways stretching beneath the hillside, chambers where experiments in metallurgy and perhaps in medicine were conducted away from daylight. The earliest surviving testimony comes from Josiah Winfield, who in 1836 was called to perform last rites for one of the Arkwright wives. In his private journal, now housed in the state archive, he described being led into a locked wing of the manor, where the air reeked of iron and disinfectant. The woman, whose name he was not given, lay emaciated on a cot, her skin marked with bruises of regular spacing, as though from instruments rather than accident. The Reverend wrote that Benedict himself stood at her side, calm and unreadable, reciting lines from Ecclesiastes as though to sanctify the moment. When the woman expired, servants quickly removed the body, not to the churchyard but down a stair into the earth. Winfield recorded his protest, but Benedict assured him that the Lord has need of her remains in the furtherance of his appointed industry. The Reverend fled Hollowford within the year. Thus the pattern was set, public acclaim shadowed by private dread, records half vanished, and a community unwilling to challenge the man who clothed his empire in the language of progress and piety. By 1838, Benedict Arkwright was no longer merely a local curiosity, but a regional power. His foundry outpaced competitors, supplying steel to Chicago, St. Louis and Cincinnati. His household swelled further, though births were often accompanied by unexplained disappearance. Those who sought employment at the foundry remarked on its secrecy. Workers were housed in barracks on the estate grounds, their comings and goings tightly monitored. Dismissed laborers vanished from the town rolls entirely, their names struck through in the ledgers of wagemaster. What little evidence survives suggests that Arkwright regarded not only his workforce, but his own household as a kind of living experiment, a proving ground for theories of inheritance, discipline and labor efficiency. His diaries, fragments of which were later recovered, contain notes that read more like laboratory observations than paternal reflections. Children are referenced, not by name but by number, their output compared in columns of figures. Wives are described in terms of resilience, yield and durability. This then is the story we begin, a tale not of simple domestic eccentricity, but of an empire of flesh and steel, hidden beneath the sheen of American prosperity. The Arkwright's history, preserved in fragments of court testimony, in scorched ledgers, in whispered recollections, reveals the most disturbing family story of the nation's industrial age, a story where the lines between kinship and captivity, between household and factory, were deliberately erased. And though nearly 2 centuries have passed since the first stones of Blackthorne Hall were laid, questions remain. Why did so few speak out when so many must have suspected? What compels a community to remain silent in the face of unnatural order? And most chilling of all, how many secrets still lie buried beneath the soil of Hollowford, sealed in chambers where the echoes of steel and the cries of the forgotten may never fully fade? The Arkwright family's presence in Hollowford was at first little more than an oddity, a curiosity that locals whispered about over mugs of cider. Yet as the years edged forward into the late 1830s, that curiosity twisted into something dark. Those who lived near Blackthorne Hall began to record incidents, subtle but telling, that marked the decline of the household from eccentricity into terror. One of the earliest accounts came from Thomas Berryman, a farmhand whose fields bordered the Arkwright estate. His grandchildren preserved his testimony in a letter written decades later, after the estate had already been abandoned. At night, Berryman wrote, "The lamps never ceased burning. I would look across the meadow at midnight and see the upper windows lit like a ship adrift at sea. Voices carried on the wind, chanting, sometimes screams, sometimes a rhythm like the pounding of hammers. My oxen would not go near the eastern fence. The beasts knew what we men pretended not." Another voice of dissent arose from the wives themselves, though their cries were muted and swiftly silenced. Rebecca Hale, remembered as Benedict's 13th wife, was the first to leave behind anything resembling a written protest. Her journal, smuggled out of the estate and hidden in a hollowed-out Bible, survives in fragments. She described days of forced labor, nights of unnatural trials, and punishments inflicted for disobedience. He insists we are not wives, but vessels. Vessels for his vision, vessels for his seed, vessels for his experiments in flesh. Those who falter are taken below, and when they return, if they return, their eyes are emptied of spirit. Rebecca's words were never published in her lifetime. She vanished in 1839, officially listed as departed to relatives in Ohio. No relatives were ever found. For the children, life under Benedict's gaze became an existence carved by rules and fear. Eyewitnesses recalled how the Arkwright brood marched through town in mechanical fashion. They spoke little, often in rehearsed phrases, as though language itself had been drilled into them like scripture. A school teacher, Margaret Hollings, noted in her diary, "I asked the eldest boy his age. He answered without hesitation, 11 years, 7 months, 3 days, 4 hours. The precision chilled me. When I asked his name, he paused, then gave a number instead." By 1840, Hollowford's sense of unease had deepened into something closer to dread. The town doctor, Samuel Greenfield, was called several times to treat fevers, accidents and births at Blackthorne Hall. His medical ledger, preserved in county archives, shows a striking pattern. Patients listed not by names but initials, symptoms described in clinical detachment, outcomes often marked as removed to estate care. Privately, in the margins of his notes, Greenfield scrawled remarks that reveal his growing horror. Too many of them look alike, features repeated, as if stamped from the same mold, a narrowing of variation, unnatural. And later, one of the wives whispered to me, "Pray for us. He is fashioning us into something new." It was around this time that deliveries to the estate increased in volume and peculiarity. Blacksmiths recalled supplying chains of unusual length and strength. Carpenters were ordered to construct heavy doors with no exterior handle. Apothecaries sold quantities of laudanum, arsenic and tinctures far exceeding domestic use. When questioned, Benedict explained these purchases as necessary for the foundry's efficiency and the health of the brood. His wealth silenced inquiry, and his polished manners reassured those who wished to be reassured. But not all could be silenced. In the spring of 1841, a group of wives appeared at the Hollowford market. They were thinner than townsfolk remembered, their skin sallow, their movements subdued. One of them, identified only as Mrs. C, collapsed in the street. Witnesses rushed to aid her, but when she was revived, she spoke only one phrase: "Do not look beneath." She was quickly escorted away by Arkwright men and never seen again. The first real fracture in the town's silence came that same year, when a laborer named Elias Turner escaped from the foundry. He stumbled into a tavern late at night, his clothes torn, his hands blistered and raw. Before collapsing, he cried out, "They are buried alive, all of them beneath the stone." Though the townsfolk hushed him, fearful of Benedict's wrath, his words took root. Some began to whisper that Blackthorne Hall was not merely a home, nor even a factory, but a prison, a labyrinth where flesh and steel were bound in ways unspeakable. Officially, however, nothing changed. Benedict's contracts with the railroads expanded, his influence reached the state legislature, and his public image grew ever more untouchable. In speeches delivered at civic gatherings, he invoked the language of destiny and providence. "The American family," he declared in one address, "is the forge upon which the steel of the nation is tempered. Mine is merely the exemplar, stretched to its proper scale." To polite applause he smiled his thin smile, and the audience ignored the hollow look in the eyes of the wives seated behind him. Yet for those who lived closest, denial was no longer possible. A neighbor, Mary Givens, recounted in her later years how she awoke one night to a sound like the grinding of gears beneath the earth. The ground trembled. She told her grandchildren, not with thunder, but with some contrivance below. "And I thought of those children, their small feet marching in time, and I wept." By 1842, Hollowford was a town divided, those who prospered from Benedict's industry, and those who shuddered at the shadows it cast. Rumors spread of wives locked away for months, emerging gaunt and broken, of children vanishing altogether, their names quietly erased from church rolls. Still, no one spoke openly. Fear had wrapped itself around Hollowford as tightly as the steel bands that emerged from Arkwright's furnace. But in the archives of that year lies one final clue, a letter, unsigned, sent to the county sheriff. It reads in part, "Sir, I cannot remain silent. There are rooms beneath Blackthorne Hall where wives are kept not as women but as specimens. Their children are bred and measured as though they were cattle. The walls are lined with iron restraints, the air rank with chemical fumes. I have seen a ledger in his own hand that lists not names but traits, as though he were cataloguing breed. If no action is taken, I fear the family will not be remembered as kin, but as an abomination. I beg you, come before more vanish into the stone." No action was taken. The letter was filed, then forgotten, and so the early signs of horror mounted, ignored by those who preferred profit to truth. Hollowford continued to prosper under Arkwright's steel, even as the foundations of Blackthorne Hall grew deeper, darker, and more secret. Beneath the veneer of progress, beneath the laughter of civic banquets and the ringing of church bells, a shadow stretched longer and darker, preparing to consume all who lived within its reach. The silence of a town had become complicity, and that complicity would soon bind Hollowford to one of the most disturbing family stories America has ever known. The journals, letters and fragments that remain from Blackthorne Hall are precious few, yet together they weave a tapestry of suffering that even time cannot obscure. By the early 1840s, as Benedict Arkwright's empire swelled with contracts and influence, those who lived under his roof endured a reality that was equal parts ritual and nightmare. The wives, numbering over 24 by this point, were kept in rigid hierarchy. The earliest marriages,
had produced children who now served as attendants, while the later wives were relegated to chambers deep within the estate, seldom permitted sunlight. In letters smuggled into the hands of sympathetic servants, several women attempted to describe their condition. One, written by Esther Brandt, survives only in fragments. He speaks of blood as others speak of scripture. He claims the family is not bound by love, but by design. We are the crucible. Our wombs are instruments, not our own. When one of us weakens, we are sent below. There he says, we will be remade, made fit again, but those who return are altered, quiet, obedient, their eyes empty of light. I dare not ask what has been done to them. Another testimony came from Margaret Dole, wife number 17, who recorded her words on scraps of linen, hidden inside a mattress. A single line survives in the county archives. I write so that someone, someday, will know we were women, not experiments, not vessels, not tools.
The children too bore witness in ways they could not fully articulate. Hollowford's townsfolk recalled how they filed into church each Sunday, dressed in identical grey garments, their heads bowed. They spoke in unison when prompted to recite scripture, their cadence mechanical, their eyes dull. The preacher, Reverend Clark, noted in a private letter, "It is as though the flame of individuality has been snuffed out. I teach them psalms, yet they repeat as if rehearsing figures in a sum. I fear their souls are being weighed and measured like metal." Whispers began to circulate of strange lessons held within Blackthorne Hall. Several tutors were hired and dismissed in rapid succession. One, a scholar from Boston, fled after less than a month. In his hastily written note to a colleague, he confessed, "I was asked not to teach letters nor arithmetic, but to measure skulls, to record the distance between eyes, the span of the jaw." The children were lined in rows, their heads shaved, their features compared as though to specimens. I was ordered to identify which bore the greatest promise for strength, which for endurance. It was no school but a breeding yard. Such claims, if spoken aloud, were swiftly dismissed. Benedict Arkwright maintained a public image of benevolence, often donating to churches and orphanages. He hosted community banquets where his wives appeared, smiling faintly under his watchful eye, their children seated in precise order like a parade of porcelain dolls. To most townsfolk it was easier to accept the fiction of harmony than to confront the possibility of horror. But the wives knew otherwise. A small circle of them began to meet in secret, exchanging whispered accounts of the locked chambers and the punishments inflicted for disobedience. One of them, later identified as Catherine Morse, attempted to escape. She was captured before reaching the river. Servants reported hearing her screams as she was dragged back through the iron gates. For weeks afterward, the wives spoke of a silence heavier than death in her former chamber. No one ever saw her again. The children themselves provided signs more chilling still. One boy, barely 8, was overheard by a servant reciting a list of numbers under his breath. Height, 46, weight, 53, head circumference, 19, eyes hazel, teeth, 28. When asked what it meant, he replied simply, "Father says I must remember my measure." Another child, a girl of 10, was discovered carving marks into the floorboards of her room, rows of tally marks grouped in clusters of 31, as though counting something she dared not speak. In Hollowford, rumors began to stir among those who had once worked within the estate. A maid dismissed in 1844 told neighbors of rooms underground, where infants cried unceasingly, tended by women who never emerged into daylight. It was not a nursery, she whispered, but a factory of flesh. Each birth was recorded, each child numbered. Those deemed weak vanished, and none dared ask where, and yet the town held its tongue. Wealth flowed from the Arkwright foundry, and with wealth came influence. The sheriff, reliant on Benedict's patronage, dismissed complaints as slander. The newspapers praised his industry, lauding him as a model of American progress. Only in private diaries and hushed conversations did the truth begin to take shape. The most damning evidence comes from Benedict himself. Among his surviving papers, discovered decades later in the ruins of Blackthorne Hall, is a ledger titled Genealogic. In it, he recorded each wife by number, each child by trait, height, weight, eye color, constitution, and even notes on temperament. Entries are clinical, devoid of humanity. Wife 9, produced 4 viable offspring, strong bone, weak lung. Child 22, male, tall frame, high endurance, poor obedience. Child 37, female, excellent teeth, docile temperament, suitable, and chillingly, defects to be corrected through further unions. Imperfections will not endure. What correction meant is left to speculation, though the vanished children provide one grim answer. The wives who attempted to resist were branded unfit. Their punishment was seclusion in the subterranean wings, where, according to later accounts, Benedict experimented with tonics, restraints, and procedures of his own. The surviving journals speak of the chair of iron, of drafts that still the will, of cuttings that leave the body altered. Whether these were crude medical experiments or tortures cloaked in scientific language, the effect was the same: silence, obedience, and the extinguishing of hope. By 1845, the atmosphere within Blackthorne Hall had grown unbearable. Servants reported that the wives no longer spoke freely, that even in private their words were measured. The children, once pliant, began to display eerie uniformity, not merely in dress or behavior, but in feature. Neighbors remarked upon it. "They look more alike each year," one farmer told his wife, "as though the bloodline is folding in upon itself." And yet Benedict remained untouchable. His influence over Hollowford was absolute, his reputation burnished by donations and piety. In sermons, he spoke of destiny, of perfecting the family unit as the foundation of the nation. "Nature is wasteful," he declared in one speech, "but man may refine it. The family is the laboratory of providence." Those who heard him applauded, though some shivered without knowing why. Inside the hall, however, the wives whispered still. Their voices, though faint, carried the weight of truth. They wrote on scraps, etched into wood, stitched into hems of garments, small rebellions against erasure. They prayed their words would survive even if they did not. The children, too, left their silent testimony in scratches on walls, in numbers muttered in the dark, in hollow eyes that told of innocence stolen. Their silence was itself an indictment, a silence heavier than speech, a silence that would one day break. For now, though, Blackthorne Hall remained sealed, its horrors known only to those within, but the foundations of secrecy had begun to crack. The wives had spoken, if only in whispers. The children had shown, if only in silence. And both whispers and silence, once heard, can never truly be forgotten. The Arkwright name still glittered in public, polished like steel, but beneath that sheen, corrosion spread, eating away at the very heart of the family, and the world outside, willfully blind, was about to be forced to see. By the mid-1840s, Hollowford thrived on the wealth that poured from Benedict Arkwright's furnaces. Steel rails bound towns together, bridges rose against the sky, and locomotives thundered across the countryside, all bearing the mark of Arkwright ironwork. In parlors and newspapers, his name was spoken with reverence, the embodiment of America's industrial promise. Yet within the walls of Blackthorne Hall, the same industry that forged steel was applied to blood and bone, shaping a private empire that few could imagine and none dared expose. The surviving documents from this period, fragments of journals, discarded ledgers, and testimonies of servants, reveal a chilling transformation. What had begun as Benedict's eccentric vision of a vast family became something colder, calculated, and methodical. He no longer regarded his wives and children as kin, but as variables in an experiment, whose scale expanded with each passing year. The ledger of perfection, among the most damning artifacts discovered decades later, was the Arkwright ledger of 1846, a book bound in calfskin, its pages dense with cramped handwriting. Each wife was catalogued, not by name but by number, each child assigned a designation, their features tabulated as though livestock. Columns of figures recorded height, weight, skull dimensions, lung capacity, and even the ability to endure sleepless nights. Wife 14, 3 birth, 2 live, strong bone, fragile disposition. Further unions advised. Child 52, male, endurance weak, dismissed from regimen. Child 60, female, docile, symmetrical features, retained for breeding. At intervals, marginal notes appear in Benedict's hand. Imperfections must not multiply. What became of those marked as dismissed is left unstated, though the absence of their names in subsequent pages speaks louder than ink. Instruments of control. Witnesses later described rooms outfitted with crude apparatuses, iron restraints fixed to chairs, tables designed for forced confinement, and racks of vials containing tinctures that dulled the will. Servants spoke of the draught, a bitter liquid administered to restless wives and unruly children. Its effect was predictable: slurred speech, vacant eyes, compliance. One servant, interrogated long after the hall's fall, recalled, "They drank, and their fire went out. They could be led like cattle." Sometimes he wrote while they sat, drooling and silent, as though waiting for their thoughts to vanish, so he could measure what remained. Benedict cloaked these practices in the language of science. He spoke of purifying the line, of eradicating weakness. He read voraciously from European texts on phrenology, eugenics, and breeding, blending them into a philosophy uniquely his own.
To him his household was a laboratory, where providence and progress intersected. Children as subjects, the children multiplying year by year, bore the heaviest burden. Townsfolk noted their eerie uniformity, the same pallid skin, the same downcast eyes, the same mechanical obedience. Tutors who entered the hall reported lessons that were nothing of the kind. One recalled being ordered to weigh the children before and after meals, to time their sprints across the courtyard, to record how long they could endure standing without motion. A note scrawled by one tutor, preserved in a bundle of papers seized after the hall's downfall, reads, "I was not a teacher, but a recorder of misery." The children were drilled, not educated. They did not ask questions. They did not play. They repeated numbers until their voices broke. Even among themselves, the children seemed unable or unwilling to resist. They spoke in unison when asked questions, referred to one another not by names but by numbers. One boy, identified as child 74 in the ledger, told a servant, "Names are for the weak. Father says numbers cannot die." The wives' desperation. For the wives, life became a cycle of pregnancy, confinement and suppression. Letters smuggled to sympathetic ears spoke of exhaustion, fear, and the gnawing suspicion that none of them would live to see freedom. Esther Brandt, whose earlier letter hinted at horrors, wrote again in 1847, "He calls us his flock, yet we are not tended but harvested. Each birth is not joy but another entry in his book. We whisper prayers, but our voices grow faint. One by one we fall silent, and silence, in this house, is the language of death." Some attempted resistance. A group of wives reportedly plotted to send word beyond Hollowford, but their message never arrived. The courier, a stable boy, vanished on the road. Weeks later, his boots were discovered in the ash pit behind the foundry. The hall as factory. Visitors to the hall often remarked on its labyrinthine additions, new wings, sealed corridors, windows that opened onto blank walls. Many assumed these were eccentricities of wealth. In truth, they concealed an underground network of chambers. Rebecca Arkwright, one of the few wives who left testimony before the collapse, later described descending narrow staircases into rooms where children were weighed, measured and restrained. "It was not a home," she wrote, "but a workshop of flesh. He spoke of us as material, of our children as alloy." Public blindness. Outwardly, Benedict remained a paragon. He financed schools, donated to churches, and spoke at civic gatherings about the importance of family. His rhetoric echoed themes of duty and providence, framing his household as a living testament to God's plan for human potential. Few dared challenge him. Those who did, disgruntled workers, suspicious neighbors, found themselves discredited or ruined. His wealth, after all, fed the town. To question him was to risk one's livelihood. A philosophy of horror, perhaps most chilling, are the passages found in Benedict's private journals. In them he revealed the philosophy that justified his empire. Man is clay, woman is the mold. Together they must be guided by one hand. Love is disorder. Affection breeds imperfection. Only control yields purity. The weak shall be repurposed. Waste must not endure. These writings confirm what the wives long suspected. Benedict did not see himself as a husband or father, but as an architect reshaping humanity. His family was not family at all, but raw material for a vision he believed would outlast empire. The growing stain. By 1848, the number of children had risen into the dozens, the wives approaching 30. Blackthorne Hall, once spoken of with admiration, began to attract unease. Travelers passing on the road remarked on the identical faces glimpsed through windows, the unnatural silence of children playing without laughter, the oppressive air that seemed to hang about the estate. Inside, the despair deepened. The wives whispered in the night, stitching scraps of testimony into hems of garments, hoping some fragment would escape. A few children, older now, began to resist quietly, scratching tally marks into beams, muttering forbidden prayers, but such defiance was rare and dangerous. The punishments they knew were swift and merciless. A family of shadows, thus the Arkwright family, entered the annals of America's most disturbing legacies, not merely for its size, but for the cold precision with which it was engineered. Behind every statistic lay a stolen life. Behind every ledger entry a silenced voice. The town of Hollowford continued to prosper, its people choosing willful blindness, but truth has a way of pressing through cracks, and by the dawn of the 1850s, those cracks began to widen. Whispers grew louder. Servants slipped away in the night, carrying fragments of truth, and among the wives, one figure would emerge who refused to be silenced. Her name was Eleanor Vale, and she would become the voice that shattered the hall's walls of secrecy. The first federal inspector to arrive at the grounds of the Steele homestead was a man named Mr. Callum Avery, dispatched in the late autumn of 8. He came not as a sheriff or officer of the court, but under the guise of a registrar of industry, charged with verifying accounts of iron out. His presence was tolerated by Jonathan Steele with a cordial smile, yet those within the house sensed immediately that the master's geniality was a thin lacquer stretched over suspicion. Avery, a pale and bookish figure, asked questions in an even tone, and though his inquiries seemed harmless, they unsettled the wives. For the first time the walls of their confinement quivered under the pressure of an external gaze. Avery was guided through the mills and the storehouses, where the clang of hammer and furnace attempted to mask the subtler rhythms of the family's private life. Yet it was not the roar of the bellows that caught his ear. It was the silence most acutely, the silence of so many women who should have been heard, and the silence of children hidden away. Steele's books listed vast numbers of mouths to feed, yet few were seen. Avery scribbled notes in a small leather-bound folio, his expression unreadable, though his eyes lingered upon the cellar doors with an unease he did not voice. Rebecca Steele, emboldened by desperation, contrived a chance to speak with Avery. In a corridor where shadows lengthened like grasping fingers, she whispered warnings of confinement, of practices unsuited to Christian men. Avery listened but dared not betray alarm, for he feared discovery. He promised nothing aloud, yet his glance conveyed a pact. He would return, not alone. That winter was cruel. Snow pressed against the windows, sealing the house further from the outside world. Jonathan declared the season providential. God's hand had drawn a barrier of white to protect their sanctity, but beneath the frozen ground, a chamber was being readied. The Steele patriarch, wary of suspicion, had ordered masons to carve a subterranean hall below the northern wing of the mansion. Ostensibly, it was to store provisions. In truth, it became a vault of flesh. Here he conducted examinations, arranging wives and children in rows upon benches like specimens. Journals recovered later reveal his obsession with measurement, skull breadth, bone length, pulse strength. Beside his notes he scrawled interpretations, some pseudo-scientific, others barely coherent. He wrote of refinement through consolidation, of strains perfected by recurrence, phrases that blend the diction of science with the madness of dogma.
Those forced into the chamber remembered the smell first: lime, iron, and damp earth. Oil lamps burned low, casting shadows that fractured across faces, making mothers and sons alike appear doubled, tripled, blurred. Jonathan Steele moved among them with calipers and quills, murmuring to himself in the cadence of a sermon. Children cried, but no soothing hand was permitted, only silence, observation, and recording. Word of these nocturnal gatherings spread among the wives. Fear became a language of glances and half-breathed prayers. Some clutched rosaries made of wire scraps, others pressed Bible leaves into their bodices, though Jonathan forbade independent worship. Rebecca once whispered, "God is not in this house." The others did not rebuke her. By February of 1835, Avery returned, this time accompanied by a colleague from Washington. They were invited to supper in the great hall. Jonathan greeted them with effusive courtesy, laying a table heavy with meats and bread. His wives, positioned like ornaments, were instructed to smile, yet the visitors noted their pallor, the hollows beneath their eyes. The inspectors requested a tour, but Steele deflected, claiming illness among the children made visits unsuitable. They departed with polite bows, yet suspicions had solidified into certainty. It was then that Jonathan became most ruthless. He declared that loyalty must be tested. Certain wives were selected at random and confined to the chamber for weeks, forbidden daylight. Children were separated, grouped according to his theories of bloodline compatibility. He scribbled upon the walls strange diagrams resembling genealogical trees twisted into knots. Rebecca, smuggling scraps of bread to the captives, glimpsed these markings and felt horror greater than hunger. She recognized her own children's initials, paired with others in permutations that mocked the natural order. By spring, murmurs of revolt stirred among the eldest sons. They were boys no longer but young men, strong from labor at the forge. Yet fear of the patriarch's wrath chained their tongues. One called Matthew dared whisper to his mother that they must flee, but Jonathan seemed always to hear footsteps where none tread, whispers where lips barely moved. Discipline was swift. Matthew was lashed in the chamber before the assembled family, his cries echoing against stone. Afterward, silence became absolute. Still, fate's hand was moving. Avery's reports had reached federal ears. Though couched in bureaucratic language, they hinted at domestic irregularities and unlawful confinement. Committees were convened. Plans were made. But inside the steel homestead, the wives and children felt only the tightening of their prison. They did not yet know that an unseen tide was rising beyond their walls. As the summer of 1835 approached, Jonathan Steele redoubled his efforts below ground. Witnesses would later recall nights when the house shook with hammering from beneath, as though something monstrous was being birthed in the dark. Lamps glowed through cracks in the floorboards, and voices chanted in low unison, whether prayer, experiment, or madness. None could say. What is certain is that the chamber had grown into a labyrinth, a hive of narrow corridors, leading to rooms without windows. In one, he installed mirrors, forcing wives to confront their own emaciated reflection. In another, he scrawled psalms across the ceiling so that captives lying supine would be compelled to read upward until their eyes ached. He told them these practices were for purification, yet to those who endured them, it felt like the dismantling of the soul. Rebecca's journal, found decades later, preserves a single sentence from that time. We are studied as cattle, yet offered no mercy as beasts are. By the closing months of 1835, the mansion had ceased to resemble a home. It had become a compound of silence and observation, where every breath seemed measured, and every gesture recorded. Jonathan Steele's fixation no longer confined itself to ledgers or genealogical diagrams. He turned instead to the body itself, the intimate machinery of bone and blood, as if the flesh of his wives and children might yield proof of his theories. He kept notebooks bound in calfskin, their margins stained with grease and ink. Within, his handwriting alternated between precise columns of data and sudden frantic bursts of scripture. He measured the wrists of newborns, catalogued the spacing of teeth, and compared the tones of skin under different lamplight. At times he commanded children to run the length of the hall so that he might time their breath. Other times he insisted on silence for hours, noting whose composure faltered first. He called these exercises the refinement. The wives understood them differently, as trials meant to break the spirit. Rebecca wrote that one winter night, Jonathan ordered 12 of the younger children to sit upon stools, eyes fixed forward, while he recited passages from Leviticus. If any child blinked or turned away, a lash followed. Their mother's pleas were ignored. When the session ended, Jonathan recorded their endurance as though marking livestock. He spoke of breeding out weakness. The language, though cold, carried an unmistakable violence. Those closest to him, eldest sons pressed into his service, were instructed to assist. Some obeyed from terror, others from a hope of favor, yet a few began to doubt. Young Samuel, scarcely 17, confided to Rebecca that he feared his father's obsession had no end. He whispered, "He studies us like glass under a lens. One day he will shatter us just to see how the pieces fall." In the spring of 1836, visitors came again, this time a doctor from Albany, persuaded by Avery's warnings to see the household for himself. Jonathan introduced him as a friend, insisting the physician had volunteered to confirm the family's good health. In truth, the doctor was horrified by what he glimpsed. Women bore bruises poorly concealed by sleeves. Infants were gone. The cellar doors were barred, yet muffled sounds bled through the cracks. He attempted to question the wives, but Jonathan hovered near, his smile unrelenting. The doctor departed swiftly, but his report smuggled to authorities was stark. This establishment is a manufactory of misery. Its master confounds science with tyranny. Its women are gaolers and captives both. Its children are not raised, but arranged. His words struck Washington like a stone in still water. The case could no longer be ignored. Inside the homestead, however, Jonathan pressed deeper into his practices. The subterranean halls grew more elaborate. Shelves lined with bottles appeared, each holding samples of hair, nails or blood dried upon cloth. Charts depicting generations were pinned to the walls, some so dense with intersecting lines they resembled spiderweb. He spoke of founding a line unbroken, perfected through trial. His voice, once charismatic, now trembled with fevered intensity. At times he staged what he called examinations of virtue. Wives were brought into the chamber and commanded to recount their dreams, their temptations, their fears. Jonathan wrote down each confession, later reading them aloud to the assembled household as proof of corruption. No privacy remained, no thought unrecorded. Rebecca, who had once challenged him openly, now chose silence, not from surrender, but from a calculated will to endure. She told the others, in whispers, that survival itself was resistance. One terrible evening in late summer, a child fell ill, little Clara,
no more than sick. Her skin burned with fever, and she could not keep food. Jonathan saw in her weakness a sign. He ordered the other children gathered, announcing that Clara's suffering was an inherited flaw, evidence of impurity. He forbade medicine, declaring that only prayer and endurance could redeem her. The mothers wept, but no one dared disobey. Clara lingered for days, her cries echoing through the stone chamber, until silence fell. Jonathan marked her death as necessary pruning. It was this cruelty that turned sons into conspirators. Samuel, Matthew and 2 others began to meet in secret alcoves, plotting escape, yet escape seemed impossible. The grounds patrolled, doors locked, neighbors kept at distance. Still, the seed of defiance grew. They resolved that if rescue came from outside, they would aid it. Beyond the estate, rumors spread. Travelers passing through spoke of smoke that rose at all hours, of voices chanting underground. A farmer claimed to have seen women in the upper windows waving cloth, though Jonathan insisted it was laundry. Newspapers printed whispers of the steel set. What had once been private eccentricity was hardening into scandal. Jonathan, sensing scrutiny, tightened his hold. He instructed that wives caught whispering were to be confined in solitude. Children who questioned commands were made to stand for hours in the snow. His journals from this time reveal a man both triumphant and cornered. They think they observe me, but it is I who observe them. Every eye turned upon me feeds my dominion. Yet between the lines one finds corrections, crossed out words, even stains that suggest trembling hands. By winter's onset, federal orders had been signed. Agents were to assemble, not merely to observe but to intervene. The house would soon face its reckoning. But for those still trapped within, the days stretched endless, marked by hunger, by fever, by the scratch of Jonathan's pen echoing like chains. Rebecca's final entry of that year reads, "The chamber has grown vast, yet we are diminished. He says the world envies us, but I think the world pities us. Still I pray it has not forgotten." The year 1836 waned beneath a sky of iron cloud. In Washington, the case of Jonathan Steele was now whispered in committee rooms, passed between clerks and congressmen like a document too foul to touch openly. The reports of Avery and the Albany physician had converged into one undeniable truth. The Steele homestead was less a residence than an experiment in tyranny. Yet the federal government moved with glacial caution. To accuse a magnate of industry, a man whose mills supplied half the state with iron, was to risk scandal, and scandal, if mishandled, could break political careers. Still, inquiry deepened, files were opened, sealed and reopened under new authorities. Witnesses were sought, traders who delivered supplies, neighbors who glimpsed strange activity, clerks who tallied the accounts. Each spoke of something irregular. Some told of wagons heavy with grain despite meager fields, suggesting mouths hidden within. Others swore they had never seen a Steele child outside the gates, though the records listed dozens. A letter from a minister, preserved among the papers, describes a visit to the homestead. The wives lined the pews like pale statues. Their eyes were not the eyes of the living. When I preached of mercy, they wept without sound. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Jonathan Steele wove his control ever tighter. He spoke less of God and more of destiny, less of scripture and more of the law. He announced that the family was chosen to endure trials that the common world could not fathom. At night he led processions through the subterranean halls, torches throwing shadows that seemed to mock their every step. Children were forced to chant passages Jonathan had written himself, phrases that fused biblical cadence with grotesque science. The seed renews, the flesh perfects, the line shall reign. Rebecca, though cowed by years of subjugation, still clung to small rebellion. She passed scraps of food to the weakest, whispered courage into the ears of her sons, and maintained a hidden record, fragments of testimony scratched onto cloth, hidden beneath floorboards. These would later serve as damning relics, proof of what had transpired. But Jonathan was not unaware of discontent. His journals reveal a man watching his household with paranoia sharpened to cruelty. He devised what he called tests of loyalty. Wives were ordered to accuse one another of disobedience. Sons were told to recite their mother's words, no matter how tender. Betrayal was compelled, then punished until trust itself decayed. Those who refused to speak were confined in dark cells, their only company the dripping of water and the scratching of rats. The chamber below, once merely a cellar, had become a labyrinth. Federal agents who would later descend described narrow corridors twisting like veins, rooms lined with bottles of preserved organs, chalk markings across the walls, and ledgers filled with numbers that no one could decipher. Jonathan had constructed not only a prison, but a philosophy embodied in stone. Each room was a chapter, each suffering wife a page, each child a line in his dreadful scripture. By early 1837, Washington had decided. A warrant was drafted, not for mere inspection but for arrest. The charges read, unlawful confinement, polygamy, perversion of medical practice, and crimes against the sanctity of family. It was an extraordinary document, for such accusations against an industrialist risked destabilizing trust in the very fabric of American enterprise. Yet the evidence, though shadowed, was too grave to dismiss. The wives and children knew nothing of these proceedings. To them, each day was another descent into ritual. Jonathan had begun experimenting with diet, feeding certain groups nothing but broth, others only bread, claiming he would discover which regimen bred resilience. Infants perished in alarming numbers, their deaths recorded by Jonathan as though they were mere adjustments to a calculation. When Rebecca wept over a lost child, he told her coldly, sorrow is weakness, you will give me another. In secret, the older sons still conspired. Samuel and Matthew whispered of breaking locks, of seizing horses, of running to the nearest town, but fear gnawed at every plan. Jonathan seemed to anticipate rebellion before it blossomed. Twice he discovered tools hidden beneath mattresses. Twice he punished those who harbored them with solitary confinement. Hope flickered like a candle in. Then, one night in the spring of 1837, a light was seen on the horizon. Lanterns borne not by Steele's men but by strangers, federal agents accompanied by local lawmen, had arrived at the edge of the estate. They did not storm the house immediately. Instead they watched. They observed the strange silence, the smoke from chimneys even at midnight, the shadows pacing behind drawn curtains. Their presence did not go unnoticed. Jonathan's men spotted movement and carried word back to the master. Jonathan convened his household in the chamber. Torches flickered, throwing light across the walls scrawled with charts and psalms. He told them that the world was coming to destroy them, that agents of envy sought to shatter what God had ordained. His voice rose in fever. We are the chosen, he thundered. The line must endure though all others fall. Some wives bowed their heads in resignation, others trembled with suppressed relief, sensing deliverance might be near. Outside, agents planned their entry. Within, Jonathan Steele prepared his defense, not of his fortune, but of his philosophy. He armed his eldest sons with pistols, stationed loyal followers at doors, and ordered that no wife or child be allowed to leave. The house, once a prison, now became a fortress. Rebecca, crouched in the shadows, recorded in her secret scraps a single line. They are. If he prevails, we are lost. If they prevail, the truth will out. The stage was set. The government would strike. The Steele family would either collapse into ruin, or reveal itself in a spectacle too dreadful for the young republic to ignore. The dawn of May 1837 broke gray and heavy, the air thick with mist that clung to the trees surrounding the Steele estate. Federal agents, accompanied by county deputies, and a U.S. Marshal, assembled at the edge of the ground. Their orders were precise: enter the property, free the captives, and bring Jonathan Steele into custody alive if possible. But none of them truly understood the scope of what awaited within the mansion. Inside, Jonathan moved with manic energy. He donned a black coat, embroidered in silver thread, a garment he reserved for what he called moments of destiny. He spoke to his wives in the great hall, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The world despises what it does not comprehend, he declared. They come not for me, but for us, for the line. If we yield, our seed is scattered to the wind. If we resist, the line will live eternal. His words were met with silence, broken only by the whimpering of children. The elder son stood at attention, muskets and pistols in hand. Some obeyed out of fear, others because Jonathan had so completely poisoned their sense of loyalty that they could not distinguish devotion from survival. The younger boys, wide-eyed, clutched sticks fashioned into crude weapons. Girls were ordered to carry water to the guards, as though even their small hands must serve the cause.
Rebecca, pale with exhaustion, tried to comfort the youngest children. Her thoughts churned with desperation. She had written testimony, hidden evidence, all ready to be delivered if only she could escape. Yet Jonathan's vigilance was absolute. Guards were posted at every exit, and the underground passages had been blocked with heavy stones. At first light, the marshal's voice carried across the grounds, Jonathan Steele, by authority of the United States, we order you to surrender yourself into custody, release your household and step outside unarmed. The silence that followed was oppressive. Then, slowly, the front doors opened. Jonathan himself stepped onto the porch, flanked by two of his armed sons. His silver hair gleamed in the pale light. He raised his hand, not in surrender but in mockery. "You come with papers and laws," he called out, "but you face a covenant older than your republic. My house is my kingdom, my wives are my temple, my children are the proof of my dominion. You shall not breach these walls." The marshal responded with finality, "If you resist, blood will be shed and it will be upon your head." Jonathan only smiled, then retreated inside. Moments later the doors slammed shut, and the siege began. The agents advanced cautiously, circling the mansion to cut off escape routes. Some were startled to discover narrow slits in the walls, disguised firing holes through which the elder sons aimed muskets. Shots rang out, and 2 deputies fell before the men had even reached the veranda. The marshal ordered his men to take cover, and soon the estate echoed with gunfire. Inside, Jonathan stalked the halls like a general directing troops. He ordered wives to barricade windows with furniture, commanded children to relay messages between floors, and laughed when the walls shook with the impact of musket balls. To him this was vindication. The world recognized his power, else why would they send so many armed men to subdue him? Rebecca seized her chance amid the chaos. She gathered 3 of her younger children and crept toward the cellar, hoping to find a forgotten passage. But Jonathan anticipated even this. 2 loyal sons caught her at the stairwell and dragged her before their father. Jonathan's fury was volcanic. "You would betray the line," he hissed. His hand struck her face with such force that she collapsed. Yet even then he did not kill her. "No," he muttered, almost to himself. "Her suffering will nourish the seed." He ordered her locked in the chamber of fasting, a dark room where food and water were denied until obedience was restored. Her children were torn from her arms and scattered among the other wives. Outside, the siege escalated. Agents dragged a small cannon into position, a relic from militia stores, and aimed it at the front doors. The thunderous blast shattered the entry, sending splinters across the hall. Federal men surged forward, exchanging fire with the Steel Sons who fought from behind overturned tables. The mansion became a battlefield. Smoke choked the corridors. Children screamed, wives huddled in corners, and the crack of musketry reverberated against marble walls. Blood stained the floorboards that had so long hidden the family's misery. Samuel, the eldest son, fought with grim determination, firing until his powder ran out, then wielding his musket as a club. But unlike his father, he felt no righteousness, only confusion, torn between filial duty and the knowledge that freedom might lie with the men in blue. He faltered, and in that hesitation, a bullet tore through his shoulder. He collapsed, moaning, as agents rushed past him. Jonathan retreated deeper into the mansion, dragging with him 3 wives and a cluster of children. He herded them into the underground labyrinth, convinced that the hidden chambers would shield him. His journal would later reveal his intention. If capture was inevitable, he would enact what he called the purification, extinguishing his own family so that no one else could claim them. But fate intervened. As Jonathan prepared to light torches within the final chamber, agents stormed the stairwell. Gunfire erupted in the narrow passage. Jonathan's body jerked as 2 bullets struck his chest. Still he staggered forward, blood blooming across his coat, and for a moment it seemed he might ignite the torch regardless. Then his strength failed. He collapsed beside the furnace, his silver hair darkened with blood, his eyes fixed on some vision no one else could see. His last words, recorded by the marshal himself, were chilling. "The line does not end with me." The aftermath was chaos. Agents freed the wives, many half-starved, their skin marked by years of punishment. Children emerged blinking into daylight, some so weak they had to be carried. Doctors who arrived days later reported cases of rickets, malnutrition, and psychological torment beyond measure. Rebecca was pulled from the fasting chamber, barely conscious, but alive. When she realized Jonathan was dead, she wept not from grief, but from the release of terror that had bound her soul for more than a decade. She delivered her hidden testimony to the marshal, who swore it would be preserved in the federal archive. News of the siege spread quickly. Newspapers dubbed it the fall of the Steel Kingdom. Sermons thundered against the dangers of unchecked patriarchy, while pamphlets debated whether polygamy itself was a gateway to tyranny. The public recoiled at the idea that such horrors had flourished for so long, concealed beneath the veneer of wealth and industry. Yet even in death, Jonathan Steele's shadow lingered. Of his 31 wives, fewer than half survived the ordeal. Of his 89 children, many were too young to remember the siege, but all bore the scars of his dominion. The government placed them in orphanages, convents, and poorhouses. Some were adopted into families who knew nothing of their past. Others vanished into poverty,
their lineage hidden by shame. As for the estate, it was seized and burned to the ground. Officials declared that no stone should remain, lest the mansion become a monument for zealots. The land lay fallow for decades, a scar upon the countryside, whispered about by locals who swore they could hear the cries of children on moonless nights. Rebecca lived on, though her health was broken. She never remarried, choosing instead to devote her life to writing down every memory she could recall of the horrors within Steele House. Her papers, preserved in an archive, remain among the most disturbing records of family life ever documented in the United States. Thus ended the reign of Jonathan Steele, the man who tried to turn his home into an empire of flesh and obedience. His death brought freedom, but not healing. For the wives and children he left behind, the scars endured, proof that even in a young nation, promising liberty, darkness could thrive in the shadows of respectability. And yet, true to his final words, rumors persisted that some of his children, grown and embittered, sought to continue his legacy elsewhere. In whispered tavern tales and stray court records, one finds hints of the line re-emerging, as though Jonathan Steele's grip reached beyond the grave. In the summer of 1837, the courthouse in Indianapolis became the stage for what many called the most disturbing legal proceeding of the century. Though Jonathan Steele lay buried beneath a plain wooden marker, his ghost hovered over every testimony, every scrap of evidence, every word spoken under oath. The case was not against him. He was beyond mortal judgment, but against the survivors of his kingdom, wives and children who carried the stain of his name. The government was determined to understand the full extent of Steele's crime. The marshal who led the raid had demanded an inquiry not only into the violence of the siege, but into the decades-long nightmare that preceded it. How had Jonathan Steele concealed 31 wives? How had he raised 89 children in conditions of near slavery without the world intervening? And perhaps most damning, had some of his wives or even his elder children aided him willingly? The trial opened with the reading of Rebecca's testimony. Carried on a stretcher into the courtroom, her frail figure silenced the spectator. She spoke in a hoarse whisper, describing nights locked in windowless chambers, days of endless childbirth, punishments inflicted for the slightest disobedience. When she recounted Jonathan's declaration that hope and love are inefficiencies, even the stenographer paused, shaken by the sheer coldness of the words. The court then examined the children. The youngest were kept away from the spectacle, but those old enough to speak were brought forward. Their testimonies were harrowing. One boy of 12, thin as a rail, told how he had been forced to stand guard at the age of 8, a musket thrust into his hands while his father promised great honor for loyalty. A girl of 15 spoke with trembling lips of being assigned to watch over her younger siblings during punishments, forbidden to comfort them as they cried. Another, barely 13, recounted how Jonathan forced them to chant nightly prayers in which he was exalted as the chosen patriarch of the line. The jury, comprised of farmers and merchants, wept openly. These were not hardened criminals on trial, but broken children who had known nothing but subjugation. And yet, the prosecution sought to prove that some of the elder sons bore responsibility for the violence during the siege. Samuel, Jonathan's firstborn, was accused of firing upon federal officers, an act that had killed 2 deputies. He sat in chains, silent, his gaze vacant. When asked why he had raised his weapon, he replied simply, "My father told me it was the only way to live. I did not know the world beyond his walls." The court deliberated for days. Ultimately, Samuel was found guilty of manslaughter, but spared the gallows. The judge, recognizing the boy's life had been shaped entirely by indoctrination, sentenced him to 15 years of labor in state custody, a decision that sparked fierce debate in newspapers. Some argued he deserved execution. Others believed he was as much a victim as the deputies he killed. Attention soon shifted from the children to the wives. Ellen Hartwell, the senior wife, faced accusations that she had enforced Jonathan's rules among the others. Witnesses claimed she had struck younger women at his command, had organized punishments, had even delivered sermons extolling his philosophy of the line. When called to the stand, Ellen did not deny these charges. Her voice, firm and resolute, stunned the courtroom. "Yes, I carried out his will, not because I loved him, nor because I believed his words, but because I knew what happened to those who resisted. I endured so that my children might survive. Every blow I struck, every order I obeyed, I did with the hope that they would live long enough to see his downfall."
The court wrestled with her testimony. Was she collaborator or survivor? Monster or martyr? In the end, she was acquitted but not absolved. Her name would forever bear the mark of suspicion. Other wives, including Rebecca, were hailed as heroines. Rebecca's act of hiding documents behind Jonathan's desk, maps of the chambers, lists of prisoners, coded records of punishments had provided the key evidence that allowed the federal raid to proceed. Newspapers across the Midwest called her the Angel of Steel House, though she rejected the title. "I am no angel," she wrote in a letter published in the Gazette. "I am only a woman who endured and who refused to let silence bury the truth." The wider world devoured the trial. Reporters filled the benches. Sketch artists captured every tremor of expression, and pamphleteers spread lurid accounts of polygamy, cruelty, and fanaticism. Preachers thundered that the Steele affair proved the dangers of unchecked patriarchy, while political reformers seized upon it as evidence for stronger laws against kidnapping and child exploitation. Yet there were those who defended Jonathan Steele even in death. Some industrialists whispered that his methods, though abhorrent, had produced unparalleled efficiency. A few radical sects claimed he had been persecuted for living by biblical principles of multiplication. Most disturbing were the letters that arrived at the courthouse from anonymous admirers, praising Steele as a visionary who had dared to defy convention. The judge ordered many of these letters burned, fearing they might inspire imitators. The trial culminated in a symbolic act. On the final day, the court ordered Jonathan's journals read aloud in their entirety. What emerged was a chilling chronicle of obsession. In neat, deliberate script, he had recorded births like inventory, punishments like maintenance schedules, and wives like departments of a factory. He described love as a corrosive element, individuality as a defect, and children as extensions of my will. One passage, dated 2 years before the raid, silenced the room. "The line must extend beyond my lifetime. If my body falls, my seed shall scatter and root elsewhere. They may burn my house, but they cannot extinguish the destiny inscribed in blood." The words cast a long shadow, even as Jonathan lay rotting in his grave. The notion that his ideology might live on unsettled both the court and the public. In September of that year, the jury delivered its conclusions. The Steele wives, though divided in loyalty, were declared victims rather than conspirators. The younger children were placed under federal guardianship to be raised in orphanages or adopted into families deemed suitable. The elder sons, including Samuel, faced sentences that reflected their actions during the siege, but acknowledged their upbringing as a mitigating factor. The case was closed, but the questions it raised were not. Could evil be inherited? Would the children of Jonathan Steele carry his madness into the world? And what responsibility did society bear for having ignored the warning signs of his growing dominion? Rebecca herself posed these questions in a pamphlet she published the following year, The Shadows of Steele. In it she wrote, "We look to courts for justice, but what court can restore stolen childhood? What law can erase memories of screams in the night, or hunger forced upon infants? Jonathan Steele is dead, but his philosophy, born of greed, pride, and the corruption of power, remains a contagion. If we do not guard against it, it will rise again in new houses under new names." Her words struck deep, for by then rumors were already spread. Several of Jonathan's children had vanished from orphanages. A handful of wives disappeared from public record after their release. Travelers whispered of communities in remote valleys where men invoked the name of the patriarch. Whether these stories were true or mere legend, they gave weight to Jonathan's dying prophecy, "The line does not end with me." Thus the trial of memory concluded, not with closure but with unease. America had looked into the abyss of one man's dominion over family and flesh, and though it had recoiled, it could not forget. Jonathan Steele's name became shorthand for domestic tyranny, invoked in sermons, pamphlets, and political debate. Yet beneath the surface, fear lingered that his children scattered across the land might one day gather and rebuild the kingdom their father had dreamed. The collapse of Jonathan Steele's empire in 1837 did not extinguish its shadow. If anything, the ruin of the Steele household marked the beginning of a darker, subtler chapter, one that outlived the man and crept quietly into America's memory. When the federal trial ended, the public demanded spectacle, punishments carried out, lives catalogued, a clean conclusion. But the truth was less tidy. 31 wives, scattered to towns and farmsteads, lived under new names. 89 children, some sent to orphanages, some adopted, some lost altogether, slipped through the ledgers of the state. And Jonathan's words, those cold journal entries written in neat script, circulated like a contagion. The pamphlets quoting him sold faster than sermons condemning him. By the early 1840s, whispers spread in Pennsylvania of a Steele sect gathering on the edge of coal towns, where men spoke of multiplying families as engines of prosperity. In Illinois, travelers told of a barn wall inscribed with Jonathan's phrase, "Love is inefficient." Whether these reports were real or invented, they revealed the deeper fear that Jonathan's ideas had taken on a life of their own, unbound from his grave. For the surviving Steele wives, life was a torment of memory. Ellen Hartwell, though acquitted, carried the weight of suspicion everywhere she went. In letters preserved by her nephew, she describes being spat upon in the street, called a collaborator, and accused of raising Steele's spoil. She retreated into seclusion, tending a small farm until her death in 1849, leaving no children alive in her care. Rebecca, by contrast, became the reluctant voice of witness. Her pamphlet, The Shadows of Steele, reached far beyond Indiana, reprinted in Boston, Philadelphia, and even London. Preachers quoted her words from the pulpit. Reformers carried her testimony into the halls of state legislatures. And yet, behind her courage lay private torment. In her diary, discovered decades later, she confesses, "I am asked to speak, but I am tired of speaking. I am asked to condemn him, but in the silence of my heart I still hear him. His voice, his orders, his footsteps in the corridor. He is dead, and yet he is not gone. He lives in my nerves, in my marrow, in the very air I breathe." Rebecca died in 1843, not from illness but by her own hand. Her final entry reads only, "I have carried him long enough." The children carried their burden differently. Some tried to vanish into the fabric of America, adopting new names, marrying into ordinary families, burying their origin story. Others rebelled violently against their father's legacy, ending in prisons or as vagrants, their rage unspent, and a few, too few, embraced his words, repeating them in secret to their own children. In 1852, a small group of settlers was expelled from a village in Ohio, after neighbors reported unnatural household arrangements. The men had taken multiple wives, citing Jonathan Steele as inspiration. One was later discovered to be his grandson. Authorities dismissed it as a scandal of religious eccentricity, but the resemblance to Jonathan's model was undeniable. The federal government, wary of igniting panic, suppressed most reports of Steele's echoes. The official narrative was one of closure: the house destroyed, the patriarch buried, the children dispersed. But those who studied the records, lawyers, doctors, and a handful of clergymen, knew the truth was less settled. In time, Jonathan Steele became less a man than a cautionary tale. Folklore absorbed him. Farmers told their children that if they disobeyed at night, old Steele would come to claim them. Campfire stories spread of his restless ghost wandering the fields of Indiana, searching for missing wives. By the end of the 19th century, Jonathan Steele was invoked in the same breath as witches, outlaws, and bogeymen, yet beneath the exaggerations lay the undeniable fact: his descendants still walked among the living. One archivist, writing in 1891, concluded grimly, "It is not the body of Jonathan Steele we must fear, but his pattern, for every nation breeds men who look upon flesh as inventory, upon love as waste, upon bloodlines as industry. Steele was not the first, and he will not be the last." Today, nearly 2 centuries later, historians still argue over the Steele affair. Was it the story of one madman, or of a society too willing to look away until it was too late? Genealogists trace rumors of his descendants through census rolls, prison records, and asylum admissions. Some claim entire branches of his bloodline survive, hidden in remote counties. Others dismiss these tales as paranoia, yet one cannot ignore the uncanny persistence of his words. In obscure internet forums, in self-published manifestos, Jonathan's phrase reappears: "The line must not end." What chills most is not that Jonathan Steele lived, that much is certain, but that his philosophy endures, finding soil wherever desperation meets pride. In this sense, Rebecca was right. His philosophy is a contagion, and contagions do not die. They adapt, mutate, and spread. The story of Jonathan Steele is not only about cruelty hidden behind the doors of a house, it is about the fragility of oversight, the ease with which power can fester unchecked, the cost of silence in the face of suffering. His house was destroyed, his journals scattered, his bones forgotten beneath an unmarked grave, and yet, like a rot beneath the foundation of a building, his presence lingers. Perhaps you have passed one of his descendants in the street. Perhaps you have spoken with them, unaware of the blood that once coursed through the kingdom of Steele. Perhaps even now in some darkened farmhouse, his words are being spoken aloud to children too young to resist. Listen carefully then, for the warning carried through generations. The line does not end. If you hear his words in your own house, if a voice tells you that love is weakness, that family is an industry, that flesh is but raw material, know that Jonathan Steele has returned, and pray you are strong enough to silence him before the line takes root again.